Hi, this is Paul. Earlier this week, I just released a short little video making some comments on Gavin Ortland and my friend Glenn Scrivener's video about Jordan Peterson. And the title of the video said, "Evaluating Jordan Peterson theologically doesn't really get at why he's an effective evangelist." And I talked a little bit about the God number one, God number two thing that I came up with a number of years ago. I've always said that the number one and number two, a lot of people complain about those. I said these are sort of boxes on my workbench because there was something that came up that I saw first in the Jordan Peterson, Weinstein, Harris conversation, Vancouver 1. And so I thought it might be fun to sort of revisit that conversation and the section, and then another critical video that sort of helped me see this in clearer terms. Now, actually, I've been reviewing some of my very early videos that once the channel started and once the channel took off, and why people are watching, why people are interested. What is it about Jordan Peterson that makes all this stuff go? And I don't know how much we can know. Certainly there are a lot of theories, and I think there's a lot of truth in many of those theories. But it was in this interchange between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris that I think a lot of finally some compare and contrast could be made. I've also noticed now that it's been a few years, and so it's interesting going back and looking back at these from a few years later, because obviously a ton has happened in terms of who he is, his own life, how things have developed in this little community around myself and John Vervaeke and Jonathan Peugeot. We've seen people go through trajectory. Many of you have had pretty dramatic changes in your life. Some of you are just sort of at the beginning of that. Others who are further into this have gone further. So I thought it might be good to sort of go back and look at this and hear it again with our ears of today. So, and I'll be, again, this has been viewed, this is Peterson's, so this is 500,000 views on this. The Pangburn one probably has more. Remember, Pangburn sort of set these things up, and then he didn't manage things, and the whole thing collapsed. But there's still someone putting out videos on Pangburn's channel, which is mostly sort of re-editing and repackaging of a lot of the stuff that Pangburn put out.
Profound of such texts is the idea that the process by which your knowledge is updated has to occupy a position in the hierarchy of values that supersedes your reliance on dogma is the fundamental claim.
Okay. And even right away, you begin to hear some of the stuff that we are all well familiar with in terms of talking about hierarchies and talking about a hierarchy of values, something that filters. And we can connect this up with John Vervaeke's relevance realization stuff. And this now, after a number of years, often the way learning goes, you hear something for the first time and it's like, well, what does that mean? But after you live with it for a while and it sort of takes up residence in your world, you have a better handle on it.
That's why, for example, in Christianity, the notion is that the word is the highest of values. And that's the embodied word. And that's the thing that mediates between order and chaos. And everything else has to be subject to that. And I would say that's not a claim that's unique to Christianity. So, for example,
okay, no, I think because we're being told we're out of time here, so I want to give Sam his reaction to that as well, and then we'll move on to Q&A.
Now, Sam's going to kind of cut to the chase in terms of this conversation, in terms of what everyone is looking at, and he's going to frame it in sort of the new atheist view. Is there a God or isn't it? And what does that mean? I thought about this a lot over the last 5 years because, again, it's sort of framed in a new atheist way as, is there a super thing in the sky? Is there a flying spaghetti monster, et cetera, et cetera? It's not a great framing of it. I think what it really boils down to is, can I have a productive relationship with being, existence, the universe? We can use all of these names that have sort of flushed in because God has become and been reduced down to sort of a super thing in the sky. And that's what I'm going to get at with the second video after this one that is completely disconnected from this one. So right away, Jordan Peterson is talking about the fact let's go back to sort of first principles here in terms of cognitive science, in terms of what in science has blown apart a world of objects, which is where Jordan Peterson starts Maps of Meaning. The problem with the world of objects is that there are too many objects in the world, number one, for us to track. And so we have to ask the question, how do we process a world that has too many things to pay attention to? The answer to that is that, and I've used this example many times, I walk into my office is filled with objects. I am not overwhelmed by walking into my office because there's a value hierarchy that says, okay, I'm probably going to turn on my computer and I already got things queued up in terms of what I have to do today, and off I go. I completely ignore all the other clutter in this office so that I get at what's there. Okay, what about this value hierarchy? Where does it come from? Well, that's pretty complicated because it's been growing in my life. It's received from a first draft from my parents. I certainly have input from my culture. I've been formed in a certain way, and I have this value hierarchy. And Jordan Peterson very much connects this with God. Now, that's not, in terms of the focal point through which we operate with the world, that very much can have the sense of an agent, but it is more than just another thing in my office. It is in some ways a thing beneath my office. And in this sense, I often use the example of Tolkien. Can Aragorn, Ranger, look for Tolkien in Middle-earth? Will Aragorn find Tolkien in Middle-earth? No, because Tolkien isn't so much an agent, another thing in Middle-earth, but there's almost no place in Middle-earth that he can't go to bump into Tolkien. And so you have this interesting dynamic. And so Jordan is making the point that all of us, without our awareness, operate in a certain way that is productive in the world. And that what we mean by this idea of God is connected with these value hierarchies, is connected with how we process the world in and of itself. Now, we're an hour and 20 minutes into this, and Jordan basically, for the first hour, has been trying to, one way or another, make this point to Sam. And I think part of why he hopes Sam can understand this is because, of course, Sam does have an advanced degree, and he's hoping that, well, surely, Sam, you know this. But Sam, again, keeps getting fixated on God as yet another thing in the world. And we're going to talk about, so God as an agent in the world is God number 2. God as the arena in which we live and move or have our being. You can use that from the Apostle Paul in the book of Acts when he's quoting pagan poets, God number 1. So there's my number 1 and number 2. Okay, let's go a little bit further.
Well, I'm tempted to just ask Jordan a question here. I mean, it's hard to know what to save for tomorrow night, but I feel like we've got 3,000 people sitting here who would really like an answer to this question. You say you believe in God. You have been...
No, I say I act as if he exists.
You say what?
I say I act as if he exists, which is a much more precise claim.
Okay, so then what, but in this case, so you act as though God exists.
Yep.
And in addition, I've heard you say that I act as though God exists, that I can't really be an atheist.
So far it seems that.
Right, yeah.
We'll see.
The night is
young. Now, again, if you think about, okay, do you believe, so you've got Aragorn and Saruman talking. We'll have Sam Harris be Saruman, and we'll have Jordan Peterson be Aragorn. Or we can have Jordan Peterson be Gandalf. The thing is, Saruman wouldn't debate this because Saruman would, well, Aragorn could say to Saruman, you act like Tolkien exists. No. Tolkien, if there's some human being running around named Tolkien, No, Sam, you don't understand what I'm saying. And this just went back and forth, back and forth. And then they go more nights, and it goes back and forth and back and forth. But you notice that they're sort of competing about frames here, because Sam wants to get down to this frame. And so if he can get Sam in this frame, he can win, because there's this frame. Is there a super thing in the sky? Can we find Tolkien maybe bumbling around the Shire somewhere and lay hands on him and say, aha, we have found Tolkien. We have evidence for Tolkien. Here he is. And Peterson's like, that's not exactly what I'm talking about when I'm talking about God. And Peterson, of course, famously had been very adverse to ditching the framing that everyone wanted to frame this in.
He's young.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I'm not really an atheist. I've heard you say this. So that
Well, some of you is.
Well, if I were really an atheist, I would be far more poorly behaved than in fact I am. Right? I would be like Raskolnikov committing murders and assuming there was.
Okay, now let's understand this a little bit better as well. In other words, what Peterson had just been talking about is this value hierarchy. And what Peterson is saying, something that, of course, later on, Tom Holland would come through and demonstrate, and others had demonstrated it as well many times, that part of what makes Sam tick, part of what makes Sam have this idea of good and bad and right and wrong has been deeply formed by his civilization and his culture, and God is in that system. Sort of like some of what makes Saruman operate and some of what makes Aragorn operate, although Saruman and Aragorn have a degree of independence from Tolkien, and authors sort of know this, because authors become real, or characters become real to their authors, and authors that betray their characters, the characters sort of disappear, they sort of disintegrate. So Peterson is making the point that, no, this is different than what you're thinking here, Sam.
Nothing wrong with it.
It would be more likely, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So
wait, that's a big distinction.
I need to know.
Be more likely.
What was that?
It's a big distinction. That you would is very different than it would be more likely. Taking the safety off the gun is not the same thing as shooting it, right?
Okay. Now, Brett, of course, much later on, we'll have much more time to unpack Brett's idea of metaphorical truth, which I think is. I understand what he's pointing at, but his framing, I think, is deeply problematic.
Yeah.
The temptations laid open to Raskolnikov would be more at hand.
Okay.
Just as they were to him.
So, in what sense do you mean? What is the God that you act as though he, she, it exists?
Okay. Now we're getting to a much more productive question.
And what is the God-shaped thing I must have in my life to prevent me from being a, quote, real atheist?
Now, notice how he even framed that God-shaped thing. And again, we're contending with, not only do we have the problem that when I walk into my office, there are more objects than I can possibly deal with, part of which is because this office is filled with books. And in each of these books, here's a really cool book that someone sent me, and one of you probably knows who you are, because I don't know who you are. And it looks like a really cool book, and I really want to read it, and I haven't read it yet. And there's a world in this book. But in a funny way, this book is a thing, but, books always have this sort of character that, is this actually a thing? Now, this gets to Jonathan Peugeot and the chair. It is a book. We can all say that, and we use it, and book is a nice word, and you all sort of know what I'm talking about. Is the book actually contained in this physical object? You say, well, because I could burn this object, and the book would continue to be here. And there's a lot of this stuff that goes on in this back and forth between Peterson and Harris, because even if every single copy of this book were to be burned, would the book be destroyed? you begin to realize it's a very difficult question. And so what has happened over the last number of years is that people begin to realize that things aren't the best way to track the world, because we don't really track the world. This book came a couple of weeks ago, and I haven't opened it yet. I look at the title, I look at the cover, The Return of Religion After Mao. Oh, that sounds really interesting, because, of course, China has been on a very interesting trajectory, and I'd very much like to read this book. I've got lots more books back here I'd like to read, and haven't really taken them in yet. So it's not quite so simple. And then when we're talking about God and what that word has been connected to in the history of English, we're using English right now, but all the different languages it's been in, on and on and on and on. This is not something, and this is again something Peterson has been pointing to all along, is that let's if we actually want to do anything with this question, let's have a little bit of care. And so now Sam is sort of, instead of just framing it in this new age YouTube business about God or no God, tell me now. And basically the answer, that question is usually, if you close your eyes, can you determine the next president of the United States just by asking for it quietly in your mind? That's sort of what the question is boiled down to. And Peterson's been resisting that all along. He says this is a far more complex conversation than just, can I close my eyes and think, I have absolutely no idea who I'd want for president of the United States, quite frankly.
Well, okay, first of all, I have to point out that there's no possible way I can answer both those questions in 2 minutes.
Well, it's the same question.
But,
I mean,
yeah,
what do you mean by God?
Okay, well, I'm going to tell you some of the things that I mean by God. Okay?
We do have to get to questions.
Maybe we're going to do this tomorrow.
Yeah, maybe this.
And I'm going to tell you some of the things I mean by God, and then we're going to talk about this a little bit.
This is where we start.
Seems like that constant.
Let's be deliberate about time.
Okay. Well, I'm going to read some things that I wrote because it's so complicated that I'm not sure that I can just spin it off the top of my head, and so you'll have.
And of course, Peterson's often mocked for this, partly because everyone sort of wants what everybody wants to. The debate, the tug of war around Peterson with respect to this question, is very much a tribal debate where we want to leverage Jordan Peterson and his fame or his notoriety for our team or against our team, yada, yada, yada. But I listened to this video quite a few times because first someone in the audience sent me a bootleg copy because the event happened and there's like, no, you have to wait for it. And then the real copies came out, and I'd listened to this a number of times. And when I listened to this, I thought, I've heard a lot of this stuff before. Because one of the things that, as a Protestant Christian minister, there are very early Reformation documents that came to the fore, and they became doctrinal statements of my denomination, the Heidelberg Catechism and the Belgic Confession. These are two early statements. And when I listened to Peterson, I recognized some of the thinking in there because I'd always noted that in these early reformational statements, they spoke in a way that a little bit later, other reformational statements kind of walked away from. And you find this because actually, as you find many people in YouTube say, many of the early Reformation figures, Martin Luther, of course, first wave, John Calvin, second wave, these people were steeped in medieval theology, church fathers, and all of this thing, because that basically was the formation. And then things continued to change. But I listened to this God that Jordan Peterson described, and I thought about many of the strange kinds of things that I had read growing up in these documents and thought, this is really interesting, because I noticed that God for Jordan Peterson, or the one that Jordan Peterson describes, now this is upon much later reflection, is much more akin to what the Apostle Paul pointed to in the book of Acts, in him we live and move and have our being. It's sort of like Tolkien relates to Middle Earth. The some of the statements in some of these doctrinal statements that caught my eye were, if God were to basically stop paying attention to the world would disappear. And I thought, because growing up, I had very much been formed in many of the assumptions that, let's say, Sam Harris carried into this conversation. And Sam Harris got that. Honestly, he's just listening to Christians, and he doesn't really probably know it very well from the inside out, and most Christians have sort of been into this. But then when I listened to Jordan Peterson, I said, there's something very old that he's pointing to, and Sam isn't understanding.
To excuse me. So, and what I'm going to do is sort of paint a picture by highlighting different things. So now I already made one point here. I made the point that part of the conception of God that underlies the Western ethos is the notion that whatever God is expressed in the truthful speech that rectifies pathological hierarchies. And that isn't all it does. It also confronts the chaos of being itself and generates habitable order. That's the metaphysical proposition.
So you can see already that God is built into the world. Now, as I mentioned in my Sam Harris video that I released this morning, Sam Harris too is sort of sliding into phenomenology. That's where philosophy has been going for a while. And so Sam Harris is sliding into phenomenology. And so when we talk about the world, we're sort of talking about it through this philosophical school that prioritizes our perception of the world. And Jonathan Pageau has very much been in there. So you very much see that this God that Jordan Peterson is talking about is very much in him we live and move and have our being. Another God number 1 and God number 2 text that I use sometimes is Isaiah 6. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. That's far away. The whole earth is full of his glory. What Jordan Peterson is talking about is the God we bump into, is the Tolkien Aragorn bumps into as he walks around Middle Earth. It's built into the environment that Aragorn sees and engages with.
And that's best conceptualized as at least one element of God. And so I would think about it as a transcendent reality that's only observable across the longest of time frames, the longest of iterated time frames, to your point. So here's some propositions, and they're complicated.
Now let's pay attention to the time frame thing, because again, there's a phenomenological underpinning to this. Let's say, for example, I can use my own childhood for this. I grew up I grew up in Peterson, New Jersey, and all around me and Peterson is a tightly packed city and filled when I was growing up with African Americans. And so my perceptual universe was made up of Peterson, which was tightly packed, filled with African Americans, and then also some suburbs, which were much more white around Peterson, but the people per square inch in the suburbs was a lot thinner. Then the white people were out there, and then every now and then we would travel a little bit ways away to family in other places, and that was even more rural, so the white people were even more dispersed. And so growing up, I always thought, well, there's a lot of black people in America, because that was my perception of it. I was a news junkie even as a kid. My parents always watched the news, so I'd watch the news with them, and I became very interested in the news and all the kinds of things that I'd hear or see on the news. And then one day I came across somebody making a statistics that African Americans were about 10% of the American population. And I heard that, I understood what 10% was, and I thought, that's got to be wrong. Because the perception of my world is that African Americans must be 60, 70, 80% of America, because 60, 70, 80% of the people I know are black. And they seem to, there seem to be lots of them. And, well, no, I was wrong. It was a perceptual question. And what Jordan makes the point of is that it's sort of like if you lived on a mountainside and you never went more than a mile from your home, you may very well think that the world is sort of like a bad man's lair in the old Batman TV show, because it's all crooked. It's not until you come off the mountain that... And the problem with human beings is we live just this short time. And so Jordan makes the point that if actually you want to be able to have a bit of experience about this God, you're going to have to deal with time, because our perceptions are very small and our world picture is shaped by those perceptions. So you're going to have to deal with time.
And they need to be unpacked, so I'm just going to read them, and that'll have to do for the time being. So, God is how we imaginatively and collectively represent the existence and action of consciousness across time, as the most real aspects of existence manifest themselves.
Now, if you heard that right there, when he's talking to Sam Harris now 5 years later, Jordan has basically figured out that for Sam, in terms of how these things function in Sam, if you look at Sam's worldview that he articulated in his conversation, God and consciousness are fairly close together. Because when Sam talks about, the one thing that is inescapable in a very Cartesian way is consciousness. And so basically, Jordan says, okay, actually for Sam, when you say consciousness, historically, you're probably getting close to this God term in terms of how this functions. Now, I understand that you watch religious people and they go to church and they pray and they're asking for parking spaces and they're asking for miracles and they're doing all of these things. I get that. And you associate all of what they're praying to Jesus or Allah or God or the Tetragrammaton or whatever. You're thinking about an old man with a beard and blame Michelangelo. And, myself and Father Eric had, and he agreed with me that, the Roman Catholics should not be painting people that look like me and calling them God, because it tends to lead to what Sam is talking about. So, but fair enough, we have Christianity, Jesus is God, I get it. I'm a Trinitarian, I have an Orthodox Christology, yada, yada, yada. But consciousness, Sam, when you talk about consciousness, that's not, you're at least beginning to get into the foothills of what this word means, at least what Jordan Peterson understands this word to mean.
God is how we imaginatively and collectively represent the existence and action of consciousness across time, as the most real aspects of existence manifest themselves across the longest of time frames, but are not necessarily apprehensible as objects in the here and now. So what that means in some sense is that you have conceptions of reality built into your biological and metaphysical structure that are a consequence of processes of evolution that occurred over unbelievably vast expanses of time, and that structure your perception of reality in ways that it wouldn't be structured if you only lived for the amount of time that you're going to live. And that's also part of the problem of deriving values from facts, because you're evanescent and you can't derive the right values from the facts that portray themselves to you in your lifespan, which is why.
Okay, so again, you've got the Tolkien Middle-earth complex here, that God is already so built into the systems that we are using to navigate this world. And again, that's part of why Jordan said to Sam what he said.
Why you have a biological structure that's like 3.5 billion years old. So God is that which eternally dies and is reborn in the pursuit of higher being and truth. That's a fundamental element of hero mythology. God is the highest value in the hierarchy of values. That's another way of looking at it. God is what calls and what responds in the eternal call to adventure. God is the voice of conscience. God is the source of judgment and mercy and guilt. God is the future to which we make sacrifices and something akin to the transcendental repository of reputation. Here's a cool one if you're an evolutionary biologist. God is that which selects among men in the eternal hierarchy of men. So, men arrange themselves into hierarchies and then men rise in the hierarchy. And there's principles that are important that determine the probability of their rise. And those principles aren't tyrannical power. They're something like the ability to articulate truth and the ability to be competent and the ability to make appropriate moral judgments. And if you...
And again, I mean, all the stuff that he's just said, we've heard him talking about this stuff for the last 5 years, and in fact, continuing to refine it and refine his language. He's had a bigger audience, but this is all God that's built into the system. The whole earth is full of his glory. In him we live and move and have our being. That's what I call God number one. And you can't, it's the Tolkien that isn't in Middle Earth, even if the Black Riders coming to the Shire can flip over all the beds and look in all the cupboards and they'll never find him, because you're misunderstanding what we're talking about.
You can do that in a given situation, then all the other men will vote you up the hierarchy, so to speak, and that will radically increase your reproductive fitness. And the operation of that process across long expanses of time looks to me like it's codified in something like the notion of God the Father. It's also the same thing that makes men attractive to women, because women peel off the top of the male hierarchy, and the question is, what should be at the top of the hierarchy? And the answer right now is tyranny as part of the patriarchy, but the real answer is something more like the ability to use truthful speech in the service of, let's say, well-being. And so that's something that operates across tremendous expanses of time, and it plays a role in the selection for survival itself, which makes it a fundamental reality.
Remember, he's answering the question, what do you mean by God? And he's saying all of this stuff. God is in a way, but again, I mean, does Tolkien make up Middle Earth? So here's the Lord of the Earth. And you might say, well, wait a minute. Is that a book? Oh, no, it's a Kindle book. Oh, it doesn't have paper. Okay, well, where's Tolkien in this book? Well, you can't go anywhere in this book and not see Tolkien. But Tolkien's not in the book. Now, again, there's Dorothy Sayers, writes herself into one of her mystery novels, but you begin to understand the complexity of this, and this is some of the complexity that Peterson is pointing to. And Sam either can't get it or doesn't want to get it or just isn't getting it at the moment or what have you, because in some ways God, and this is sort of how it's been functioning. I've talked a little bit about, all the evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychology is something that points to God. Oh, but we don't want to say that word. Well, why? Well, because of so again, it's sort of the agentic aspects of it. And so when Peterson talks, people are sort of divided because, especially Christians that are very used to relating to God in a very personal way. And I've talked about, I laid all this out a number of years ago with John Vervaeke. I said, the spirit of finesse is really the proper mode for us to engage something of this magnitude, not the spirit of geometry. So,
Jordan, if I can I just cut in here with one question?
Stop with that for now.
What?
And of course, when I listened to that, I thought, I know what he's talking about. Now, in him we live and move and have our being. The whole earth is full of his glory. This is the Arenic God. But now Sam doesn't get this at all.
So I was not hearing in that list of attributes a God who could care if anyone masturbated.
Caring. So here's a conversation just posted yesterday between John Vervaeke and my friend Sam Tideman. And Sam, not only, you often see him in his office in the corner doing Randos conversations where we're doing live streaming and stuff like that. He has a channel called Transfigured. He's known to be our Unitarian in the corner, et cetera, et cetera. But he also works for a major tech company and works on AI and has worked in healthcare. And so he begins this whole conversation asking the question about what makes a better emergency room. And it's a very difficult thing. And they're talking about AI because Sam works on AI. And part of what, so AI, they've got these large language models, are doing all of these things, but part of what they can't get these machines to do is care. And care is actually a critical aspect of agency.
Point we just made is the machines don't have intentionality, not just in the sense of working towards something, but they don't care about.
Yeah.
They don't care about what's true, good, and beautiful. They are in no way rational agents. They are not motivated to care about the meaning of what they're doing, or whether or not they're self-deceived, or whether they're in error. So all of that capacity of caring, and I think that overlaps with relevance realization, is missing. They're not. It's not just that they. It's not just that we haven't figured out how to bridge between the normative and the causal. It's also, we have failed, I would argue, largely to recognize how much that's bound up with a capacity for caring about the true, the good, and the beautiful in a way that matters to the agent and not to some external authority.
Or caring about anything.
Now, that's really critical to this conversation, because, of course, when I talked about God number one and God number two, I said, it's not that God the Father is God number one and God the Son is God number two and the Holy Spirit is number one. No. All persons have number one and number two in them. If you look at the story, The Cat in the Hat, the mother is a character in that story. I don't have a copy of the book here in my office, regrettably. But about all we ever see of the mother is her leg, if I recall. But the agent called Mom is an arena in which all of the drama between the Cat in the Hat and the children in the home and thing one and thing two are operating. And so human beings have this amazing capacity to have both oneness and two-ness, arenic qualities and agentic qualities within us. So now Sam Harris is basically saying, hey, wait a minute, what about a God that cares if you masturbate? Okay, well, if that's what you want to talk about, Sam, we can talk about masturbation. And of course, everybody laughs because Sam is a very articulate. He's got tremendous rhetorical skills. Okay, and part of the reason, let's say in late antiquity, someone like Augustine, rhetoric was a very popular thing to study, was because people realized that rhetoric is powerful. But if we go all the way back to Plato and Aristotle understood that the sophists were super clever. But to call someone a sophist today basically says you're rhetorically clever, but your system is bankrupt, corrupt, or found wanting.
I was not hearing a God who...
Depends on what else is stopping you from doing, Sam.
Sorry, I missed that.
I said it depends on what else it's stopping you from doing.
Well, yeah, okay.
And again, Sam... Oh, okay. No. Jordan said something with that retort. It wasn't just witty and clever. It again went back to everything that Jordan had been talking about. And Sam hasn't either been paying attention to, hasn't understood, hasn't wanted to engage. I don't know the reason. But not a great conversation partner with respect to this, because there's plenty to talk about. And, okay, but caring. Okay, good point. Caring. Because part of what people wrestle with the problem of evil, let's say, is Nathan Jacobs. I still have to get Nathan Jacobs back on the channel. Nathan Jacobs did this cool documentary about becoming fully human, and people talked about the problem of evil, and a woman talked about the fact that she had a beloved uncle who was a good guy. He was a smoker. He fell asleep. You used to hear about this a lot more in the 70s than you hear about it today. All the flame retardant sheets. And they did a lot of work on this. They did a lot of work on this in the environment to basically, and this is a lot of what's happened in American culture, so that the agents are in a safer space. I'll use that language. So her uncle died in a fire because he smoked in bed and, fell asleep probably watching TV or reading in the cigarette butt, and it lit the sheets on fire, lit the bed on fire. The uncle died in the fire. And she said, would it have been so hard for God to come and move the cigarette? Well, almost all the arguments that usually go along with says, well, Do you want the kind of universe in which fire doesn't burn? Because that's part of, in him we live and move and have our being, and that's part of the whole earth is full of his glory. Because if you're freezing, or if you have to cook meat, or if you have to boil water, boy, the heat of that fire is pretty important. But if you're falling asleep with a cigarette in your mouth, so where is God? Well, that's a difficult thing to talk about.
So it's important to live. It's important to do something other than masturbate.
Yes. Yes, which actually constitutes a problem for many people.
Which is harder than it sounds.
Yeah.
I'm not hearing a God, a personal God who can possibly hear anyone's prayers, much less answer them.
Right there. See, God number 2. This is what we're arguing about. I want to be able to close my eyes, to say this prayer inside my head, and determine the winner of the next presidential campaign. Now, please let it not be Trump. Please let it not be Biden. Whatever you want to pray. That's because what I'm talking about is people who walk around imagining that they can control the universe by saying prayers in their head, or somehow life goes better if they go to church. And someone say, well, actually, life does go better if you go to church. Statistics and stuff. Oh, okay. But that's not because they closed their eyes and said a little prayer and something happened.
Right. And I'm wondering what percentage of religious people who would say, oh, yeah, I believe in God and it's the most important thing in my life, what percentage of those religious people do you think have in mind a God of the sort you just described?
And then when he said that, I thought, oh, you might be surprised, because that actually gets built in believers at a very deep level that they might not be conscious of. But if you read in the old books, it's there. And that's what I recognized when I listened to Jordan Peterson's list. And I said, oh, yeah. And then, then thinking about it, I'm a minister. I've preached through a lot of the Bible. Passages come to mind. It's like, what do you mean by that?
I don't know, Sam. It's a good question, because when I go talk to people, when I talk to people online and use exactly this terminology, millions of people listen. So it's not so obvious what percentage of people see it this way. It may be that they have the intuitions, but they haven't.
And in fact, if people weren't listening, Sam would not have had this conversation with Jordan, because enough people were listening and beginning to say things like, yeah, I used to listen to Sam, and boy, everything he said just seemed to click, and it just seemed to be right. But then I started to listen to Jordan Peterson, and then I started to want to read the Bible. And he did this Genesis series, and people came from all over the world to listen to him. And at least one Christian minister in Sacramento saw this happening and said, I better keep my eye on this, because I got stuff to do here, but this is important. Something is happening. And I better pay attention. Now, I might not be smart enough to figure the whole thing out right away, but at least I'm smart enough to pay attention to it. There's plenty of people out there, and I'm going to get some comments in this. Why don't you not talk to Jordan Peterson, blah, blah, or no, don't talk about Jordan Peterson, blah, blah, blah. No. Just because I pay attention to him doesn't mean I agree with everything. No, Jordan and I could have plenty of conversations about what we do and don't agree with, yada, yada. That doesn't make any difference. Something's going on here you have to pay attention to.
Been articulated well.
I mean, this is the problem.
So it's not so obvious what percentage of people see it this way. It may be that they have the intuitions, but they haven't been articulated well.
I mean, this is the problem. This is what worries me about this. So.
Oh, you're worried. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you could do the same thing with the idea of ghosts, right? So people traditionally have believed in ghosts. It's an archetype, you might say, the ghost. Survival of death is certainly an archetype. And we know what most people most of the time mean when they say they believe in ghosts. And I say, I don't believe in ghosts.
A ghost is something that is not really an equivalent to how most of humanity has been organizing itself around something roughly equivalent to God.
And you say, no, you do believe in ghosts. Ghosts are your relationship to the unseen. That's a ghost. So you have a new definition of ghost that
No one ever defines ghost that way.
you're putting in the place provided, which I have to say, well, of course I have a relationship to the unseen, so yeah, I guess I do believe in ghosts. You know, you win that argument. But that simply isn't what most people mean by a ghost. Most
yeah,
people
but you
mean,
can't use that simplified argument about my conception of ghosts as an analogy for the propositions that I just put forward.
This is what I see you do. I mean, maybe you have more to say on the topic of God, but this is what I hear you doing with God. You have defined the God that most people believe in, and we know this is the God that most people believe in.
I was asked what God I believed in. Not
Yes,
what
no,
most
but
people
I'm asking you what percentage. Yes, but you by shifting the definition, you have robbed the noun, the traditional noun, of its traditional meaning.
See, now, he didn't shift the definition, but what he actually knows is a little bit of, and what he's learned through psychology is a little bit of history. And that's why I had number 1 and number 2, because Sam isn't totally wrong here. But what Jordan is pointing to is unrecognizable for Sam.
And you're imparting to people
Hey, wait a second. Wait a second, people.
I'm not so
what
sure
do you
of
mean by
this.
traditional meaning? Look, it's one of the elemental claims in the Old Testament is that you're not even supposed to utter the name of God, because by defining it too tightly, you lose its essence. And so let's not be talking about what the classical definition of God is here, okay? It's a historical non-starter.
Okay,
and there's plenty of
Hold on.
religions that
Can I check in with the audience? Is the audience all right with us continuing down this road? Okay. So,
And everybody wanting to talk about this, why? Because if Jordan is just playing fast and loose with words, then everybody will see it. But everybody has an intuition that we're actually finally trying to get to something that's important here. So don't let it happen tomorrow night, because I don't have tickets for tomorrow night.
can I jump in here?
You're sacrificing your Q&A.
So,
Always the parent.
Which actually constitutes a problem for many people.
Which is harder than it sounds.
Yeah.
Believe in ghosts.
The Testament is that you're not.
is the audience all right? So, yeah, that it is at the expense of Q&A. That's what you're giving up. But I think it's probably worth it. So, let me say, Sam, I do not believe in a supernatural God. But the God that I heard Jordan just describe, I do not have any difficulty understanding why he might care if you masturbate, and I also don't have any trouble figuring out how he might answer prayers.
So Brett basically says, okay, Sam, I don't think you can close your eyes and, have an in with a guy who looks like me, maybe has better hair, but he does have a white beard, and pulls levers of the universe and decides who's the president. But I understand something of what Jordan is saying here.
Well, tell me more then.
Well, I can tell you.
Because Sam's whole shtick is, it's just obvious. I mean, you hear him say, it's just obvious. It's obvious. It's obvious. Well, Brett says, no, wait a minute. I understand what Jordan is saying. Don't tell me more.
I can tell you how a prayer might be answered.
Okay, but these are...
Well, it's specific, so you could let me do that.
So it'll be interesting. So I'm not Jordan. We've not talked about this. If I heard an answer from him that actually would satisfy me as to what the mechanism of action might be, that'd be pretty interesting. And if he can tell me what I heard...
Mechanism of action. Now, that mechanism word is not unchosen. If you go back, I just did a lot of work on the Jordan Peterson Sarah Hill conversation, which was excellent. She also keeps talking about mechanism. Well, why do all these scientists talk about mechanisms? Well, it's because that's what science is about under the deist revolution, undisclosing mechanisms. And so, okay, well, we want... God number one is sort of mechanistic because, well, these early natural philosophers, what they did was they were all Christians and believers, and when they were doing their science, they thought they were learning about God. Well, wait a minute, you're dropping spheres from a tower in Italy. No, yeah, and I'm learning about God by dropping spheres. Well, that has nothing to do with God. Again, God number 2. Sam Harris's God. But what about God number 1? In him we live and move and have our being. The whole earth is full of his glory.
I think it would suggest that we're not just making up stories here.
Okay, so you might like this, you maybe not, but, well, it's possible. Okay, so imagine that, so let's imagine that hellish situation that you laid out. Okay, but let's put the extra twist in it, because one of the things that we both decided, I think, was that you also have to build in the intent into that. So let's say...
So, okay, now this goes on a little bit, and go ahead and listen to the whole thing, but I've got a limited amount of time, so I want to get into the other video. Those who've been around the channel a long time might recognize this. This is Christine Hayes, Yale Courses, lecture number 2, The Hebrew Bible in its Ancient Near East Settings, Biblical Religion in Context.
Approaches: historical, literary, religious, cultural, and today we are going to begin our appraisal of the first portion of the Bible as the product of a religious and cultural revolution. The Bible is the product of minds that were exposed to and influenced by and reacting to the ideas and cultures of their day. And as I suggested in the opening lecture, comparative study of the literature of the ancient Near East and the Bible reveals the shared cultural and literary heritage at the same time that it reveals great differences between the two. In the literature of the Bible, some members of Israelite society, probably a cultural, religious, and literary elite, broke radically with the prevailing norms of the day. They mounted a critique of prevailing norms. The persons responsible for the final editing and shaping of the Bible, somewhere from the 7th to the 5th or 4th century BCE, right? We're not totally sure, and we'll talk more about that. But those final editors were members of this group, and they had a specific worldview, and they imposed that worldview on the older traditions and stories that are found in the Bible. That radical new worldview in the Bible was monotheism. But why, you might ask, should the idea of one God instead of many be so radical? What is so different? What's different about having a one God from having a pantheon of gods headed by a superior God? What is so new and revolutionary about monotheism? Well, according to one school of thought, there isn't anything particularly revolutionary about monotheism. And the classical account of the rise of monotheism that has prevailed for a very long time runs as follows, and I have a little flow chart here to illustrate it for you. The argument goes that in every society, there's a natural progression from polytheism, which is the belief in many.
Now, what she's about to lay out as the alternative to what she will eventually talk about is it's basically evolutionary monotheism. That monotheism develops in an evolutionary process. And this is basically what you hear Jordan Peterson talk about sometime. And she's going to suggest something other.
Gods, usually these are personifications of natural forces, to henotheism, heno, one God, or monolatry, which is really the worship of one God as supreme over other gods. So not denying the existence of the other gods, ascribing reality to them, but isolating one as the supreme God, and on to monotheism, where essentially one believes only in the reality of one God. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, this progression was viewed as an advance, which is not very surprising because the whole theory was put forward by scholars who were basically Western monotheists. And these scholars maintained that certain elements of biblical religion represented pure religion. Religion evolved to its highest form, no longer tainted by pagan and polytheistic elements of Canaanite religion generally. So applying an evolutionary model to religion carried with it a very clear value judgment. Polytheism was understood as clearly inferior and primitive. Monolatry was an improvement, right? It was getting better, it was getting closer, but monotheism was judged to be the best and purest form of religion. And at first, the great archaeological discoveries that I talked about last time in the 19th century seemed to support this claim that Israelite monotheism had evolved from ancient Near Eastern polytheism. Cuneiform tablets that were inscribed with the great literature of Mesopotamian civilizations were uncovered, and when they were deciphered, they shed astonishing light on biblical religion. And these discoveries led to a kind of parallelomania. That's how it's referred to in the literature. Scholars delighted in pointing out all of the parallels in theme and language and plot and structure between biblical stories and ancient Near Eastern stories. So more than 1,000 years before the Israelite legend of Noah and the Ark, you have Mesopotamians telling the story of Ziusudra, or in some versions, Utnapishtim, who also survived a great flood by building an ark on the instruction of a deity, and the flood destroys all life, and he sends out birds to scout out the dry land, and so on. So with parallels like these, it was argued, it was clear that the religion of the Israelites was not so different from the religions of their polytheistic or pagan neighbors. They also had a creation story. They had a flood story. They did animal sacrifices. They observed purity taboos. Israelite religion was another ancient Near Eastern religion, and they differed from their neighbors only over the number of gods they worshipped, one or many. It was just a more refined, more highly evolved version of ancient Near Eastern religion. Well, this view, this evolutionary view or evolutionary model, was challenged by a man named Yechezkel Kaufman in the 1930s. And Kaufman argued that monotheism does not and cannot evolve from polytheism because the two are based on radically divergent worldviews, radically divergent intuitions about reality. And in a multi-volume work, which was later translated and abridged, and you've got a selection of reading from the translated abridgment, so it's translated by Moshe Greenberg, an abridged version of his massive work, The Religion of Israel. Kaufman asserted that the monotheism of Israel it couldn't be the natural outgrowth of the polytheism of an earlier age. It was a radical break with it. It was a total cultural and religious discontinuity. It was a polemic against polytheism and the pagan worldview. That's implicit, he says, throughout the biblical text. It's been said that Kaufman replaces the evolutionary model with a revolutionary model. This was a revolution, not an evolution. Now, one advantage of Kaufman's model is that we avoid some of this pejorative, we can avoid some of the pejorative evaluations of polytheism as primitive, right, as necessarily earlier and primitive and inferior. They're simply positing the existence of two distinct orientations, two divergent worldviews. They each have their explanatory merits, and they each have their specific problems and difficulties. It's not to say that Kaufman wasn't clearly judgmental, but at least the potential is there for us to understand these as two distinct systems, each, again, as I say, with its explanatory merits. But as we'll see, some of the things that monotheism solves only invite other sorts of problems that it has to wrestle with throughout its long life. Now, in Kaufman's view, the similarities, therefore, between the Israelites and ancient Near Eastern religion and cultures that everyone was so busily finding and celebrating, these were, in the end, similarities in form and external structure, appearance. They weren't essential similarities. They differed in content. Sure, they both have animal sacrifice. Sure, they both have ritual purity laws. Sure, they share certain stories and legends. But these have been adopted by the Israelites and transformed into vehicles that convey the basic ideas of the monotheistic worldview. So a similarity in form doesn't mean a similarity in function. And in this, Kaufman's anticipating arguments made by anthropologists. The ritual cult of the Israelites may look like that of their neighbors, but it functioned very differently. Its purpose was drastically different from that of Israel's neighbors. The Israelites, like their neighbors, may have set up a king over themselves, but Israelite monarchy differed from Canaanite monarchy in significant ways because of their monotheism. These are all things we will test and explore. So the meaning and function of Israel's cult, of Israel's king, of its creation stories, or any of its other narratives, they derive from the place of those items within the larger cultural framework or worldview of Israel, and that larger framework or worldview is one of basic monotheism. So let's turn then to Kaufman's description of the fundamental distinction between the polytheistic worldview and the revolutionary monotheistic worldview that took root in Israel. And I am going to be rehearsing and then critiquing the arguments that are in that 100-page reading that I assigned for you this week. This is the only time something like this will happen in the course. And I do that because these ideas are so fundamental, and we are going to be wrestling with them throughout the course. So it's important to me that you absorb this stuff right from the beginning and think about it and be critical of it and engage it. Kaufman's ideas are very important. They're also overstated in some ways, and that's why we're going to be wrestling with some of these ideas throughout the course. So let's begin with Kaufman's characterization of what he calls pagan religion, right? That's the term that he uses. The fundamental idea of pagan religion, he says, and I quote, the idea that there exists a realm of being prior to the gods and above them, upon which they depend and whose decrees even they must obey, the meta-divine realm.
Okay. Listen to that again.
This they and above them. Idea that there exists a realm of being prior to the gods and above them, upon which they depend and whose decrees even they must obey, the meta-divine realm.
Functionally, that is exactly the situation we find ourselves if you begin the story of the universe from a physicalist, materialist starting point. That, well, these gods are things that human beings make up. And therefore, these gods are subject to human psychology. These gods are subject to all of these things. But fundamentally, there's a metadivine realm into which all of these fictitious gods that we are projecting up into the sky work. Now, of course, the ancients didn't see it that way. They have their myths of how these gods were formed, etc., etc. But notice that there is, in fact, an impersonal space into which personal agency of caring and action come and colonize the rest of the world, but they are still subject to that impersonal space.
This is the realm of supreme and ultimate power, and it transcends the deities. All right, the deity or the deities.
So physics is this realm, wherever you imagine that these laws of physics came from. This is the realm of supreme ultimate space, and it transcends the deity. That's why you have this this fetus around this word supernatural. And that is just a complete fetus, and it's basically because of the scientific lab leak.
Emerge from and are therefore subject to the laws of the metadivine realm, the forces and powers of the metadivine realm. And the nature of this realm will vary from pagan tradition to pagan tradition. It might be water, it might be darkness, it might be spirit, or in ancient Greek religion, a more sort of philosophical polytheism, it might be fate. Even the gods are subject to the decrees of fate. They have no control over that. Kaufman asserts, therefore, this belief, once you posit a primordial realm, some realm that is beside or beyond the gods, that's independent of them and primary, you have automatically limited the gods. So what I've done is I've spelled out here for you consequences, logical consequences of positing a metadivine realm. You know, once you have a metadivine realm, all of these things are going to follow. The gods are going to be limited. All right? They are not the source of all. They are bound by, they're subservient to this metadivine realm. There can therefore be no notion of a supreme divine will, an absolute or sovereign divine will. The will of any one God ultimately can be countered by the decrees of the primordial realm, and the will of all the gods can be thwarted by the decrees of the primordial realm. The will of any one God can be thwarted by perhaps another God. All right? So the gods are limited in power. They're also limited in their wisdom. Right? That falls under this as well. They're not going to be all-knowing or all-wise because of the existence of this realm that's beyond them, and which is in many ways mysterious to them as well. It's unpredictable to them too. It's not in their control or in their power. Individual gods might be very wise. They might be wise in particular crafts. They might be a god of healing, very, very wise in healing, or a god of some other craft or area of knowledge, but they possess wisdom as an attribute, not as an essential characteristic. Kaufman asserts that mythology is basic to pagan religions. Mythologies are the lives or tales of the lives of gods, tales of the lives of the gods. In pagan religions, the gods are born. And they live lives very similar to human lives, but on a grand scale, and then they die. They might be reborn too. Pagan religions contain Theogonies, the birth of a god, theogony, accounts of the births of gods. Now, this impersonal primordial realm, Kaufman declares, contains the seeds of all beings. Very often in these creation stories, there is some sense of some realm from which life begins to emerge, usually beginning with God.
All right, I gave you a sense of it. And the link will be below, you can watch the whole thing and you can get a good sense of it. The heart of this is that for the Hebrews, well, in him we live and move and have our being. The whole earth is full of his glory. There's an agentic aspect to God. And that agentic aspect is an aspect that we live within. Now, this gets insanely complex. And Christine Hayes, now she takes this whole thing from sort of a modernist, scholastic approach. But her course is excellent. It's very much worth listening to the whole thing, and it's free on YouTube. You can just listen to it and write in the Yale thing. Like Kaufman's book, unfortunately, is difficult to get because I started talking about it, and everybody scooped up the copies that were out there used, and the remaining ones got crazy expensive. But this is kind of what's going on here. That part of what happens with deism is that, in a sense, there is another metadivine realm created, and God is then reduced to kind of a pagan god. And then in the 19th and 20th century, we see all of that. Well, the Hebrews have their god and the Greeks have their god, and you see that again and again and again, but no, it's different. And of course, then with Christianity, of course, with the incarnation of Christ, well, this is going to get even more complex because now, although in the Old Testament, the Lord is very clearly an agent. The Lord walks with the man and the woman in the garden. The Lord debates with Abraham the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. The Lord chooses Israel. But God has that dual quality. He is both arena and agent. Now that's very short dip into what I've talked about for years now on this channel with respect to these issues. But that is in many ways what is behind a lot of this conversation where, well, we can play a little bit more.
The hell that we're talking about isn't the victim of the terrible massacres that you laid out in the jungle story, but a perpetrator. Okay, so someone who's actually acted in a malevolent manner, truly malevolent manner. Okay. Or maybe perhaps we wouldn't have to take that extreme case. We could say, well, perhaps you've decided that, you've decided that you've seriously done something wrong, okay, and that you want to get away from hell. You want to make things better. Okay, so here's an exercise you can try. So what you do is you sit on the edge of your bed and you say, okay, what I did was wrong. And you have to really believe this, right? So you've thought about it. It's killing you. It's killing you. So now you're penitent and you're confessing, let's say. And you're confessing to yourself as much as to anyone. And you say, I really want to know what I did wrong. And I really want to know what I could do to put it right. And I'm willing to accept any answer that will manifest itself to me. You try that. See what happens. Well, that's a prayer that will be answered, and it won't be answered in the way that you want it to be answered. I can bloody well tell you that.
Okay, but that...
Well, what are you communicating with when you do that? What are you communicating with when you do that?
No, that is something that is a process that I'm familiar with. It doesn't require any supernatural explanation, and it certainly doesn't require that we imagine that any of our books were dictated by the creator of the universe.
I didn't say that it required any.
Again, notice where he goes back to. But Peterson he's landed a blow here because what everyone has to admit is, I don't know what happens. I don't know who hears. I don't know why something like this seems to move the universe. And of course, Christians all over who pray every day will say, yes, I completely understand that if I close my eyes, I don't pick the next president of the United States. I get that. But I am still doing something and participating something that is bigger than myself, and I can't fully understand it, but it's real.
Any supernatural explanation, or that it required the book. I was asked to provide an instance of prayer that worked, and that's what I did. I didn't do anything other than that.
That's fully understandable in terms of human psychology. And
it's not understandable because we don't know where the answer comes from.
Well, we don't know where anything comes from.
That's true.
Yeah, okay, so...
He could have said, gotcha.
Yeah, but that doesn't open the door. I mean, one thing we can know with absolute certainty is that whoever wrote the Bible didn't know either. And there's many other things he or she didn't know, like everything else we know scientifically, right?
It's not so obvious what people know and what they don't know.
No one even knew the brain was involved in any of this. Right. So
yeah, but they probably knew about as much as we do about how the brain was involved in it.
But we've already established in some tenuous way that things that nobody understands could have evolved into these stories in some way that would be useful, but nobody knew what they were writing when they wrote it, right?
The problem is that you can, so again, this has been focused through the lens of your attachment to Christianity largely, but Hinduism is a completely different.
All right. They're going to go for a while. Sam is saying, well, Christians don't have magic. Do you know what Christianity says about magic? Why on earth did Saul have so much trouble finding that witch of Endor? So what Jordan does here is Jordan brings back into the culture basically, in some ways, revolutionary monotheism. Because suddenly we have to realize that the other day I thought about the fact that, again and again you hear these new atheists sort of scoffing at a universe where the earth is at the center of. Now, for a very long time, once that scoffing started, a lot of classicists like C.S. Lewis were saying, oh, well, wait a minute, that's not exactly fair. When you say the earth is the center, that's not really where the earth was. This ancient and medieval conceptualization of cosmology, actually earth was sort of at the bottom. And when you look at essentially what we did when we decided that human beings are the only agents in the universe that matter. Oh, maybe there's aliens off someplace else. But human beings are the only agents that matter in the universe. Okay, so maybe you're crowing about a change in geography and cosmology, but what you've really done is, and this gets into the meaning crisis, what you've really done is taken out all other agency in the universe and placed us at the top. The difficulty, of course, is that there are so many of us, and we don't agree and we don't get along, and so we have wars, and now we're at the precipice of maybe killing ourselves in the meta crisis. But we really did destroy everything else in our map in the universe and left ourselves in charge. And the thought that we might not be in control, and the ancients actually knew some things that we don't, which of course they knew a lot of things that we don't. That's why we read history and like, boy, I really wonder what was going on there. Well, they kind of knew something of that too. That the world is different. And what has happened over the last 5 years is basically Jordan has been winning and Sam has been losing. There used to be a video out there where I don't know if I can find it anymore because the guy stopped his channel. YouTube is a place where things come and go and things disappear. But this has been what's happening. And it makes sense when you see the overall end of a particular world. Or maybe we're seeing the end of a particular chapter of this world where, as what we always do, humanity overreached and said, oh, wow, we can measure balls falling from a tower in Italy. I bet you we can account for everything. No, Can't do it. Because the more we know, the more we begin to learn that we don't know. So, God number one and God number two. A big part of why Jordan Peterson had an impact is he opened up what had always been known and been always part of the definition since the Hebrew scribes of God. So that's my God number one, God number two. It's not 20 minutes, but I hope it sheds some light on the conversation. Leave a comment.